Domestic violence in the workplace, it's there. What to look for and how to respond. Let's get started.
From the front lines of violence prevention, digging into the details that matter and filtering out the fluff, get ready for a fast-paced information download that will prepare you to ask the critical question. When disaster strikes, are we good? Now, here's Jim Bennett.
Welcome to Are We Good? And today we have with us Lynn Fairweather. She is a survivor of abuse who has worked in the violence and prevention field for more than 30 years. And she's president of the Presage Consulting and Training team, as well as author of Stop Signs Recognizing, Avoiding, and Escaping Abusive Relationships. So today we're going to focus on domestic violence and its connections and impacts on the workplace. So Lynn, let me just ask you really quick to kind of start us off with just a brief definition of what is domestic violence?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Jim. It's a pleasure. So domestic violence is essentially a pattern of power and control that emerges in intimate partner relationships. And it manifests in a lot of different types of abuse. So physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, psychological, financial. And so people who are experiencing domestic violence are experiencing it over and over in a pattern or a cyclical form.
Hmm.
And many people don't understand just how common it is.
Interesting. So how common is it where it impacts the workplace? I think a lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we're thinking very much in terms of what's going on at home, but we know that does spill and manifest itself as well in the workplace. How common is that?
Well, believe it or not, 21% of all employees, male and female, are experiencing at least one form of domestic abuse from the ones that I just mentioned. And
Wow.
that might be a surprising number to your audience because it's not something that we see. It's not something that people talk about.
Mhm.
So you probably would not know that the people who are working right next to you are experiencing this. The real problem is spillover, as you mentioned. And that comes in the form of absenteeism, lost productivity, people who are coming into the workplace not able to do their job or not able to get to work. And about 60 to 90% of employees who are experiencing abuse say it impacts their work negatively. So it's really not
Wow.
a question of if domestic violence impacts your workplace, it's just when and how.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are kind of the warning signs that managers and colleagues should be aware of? Like you gave a couple examples of how it can be seen in the workplace. Give us some more ideas of what those warning signs are. And again, with the limitation that it doesn't immediately mean that there's domestic violence, but it's worthy of concern, correct?
Yeah, definitely. So I work in the field of threat assessment and management specifically. So we often talk about a departure in baseline, which means that somebody is acting differently than they normally do. So when you see a departure in baseline, you may not understand what's behind it, but you know something's not right. So
Mhm.
in domestic violence, we often see people who are not able to focus on their work. They are often anxious or depressed, particularly after communication with their partner. They may be displaying injuries or obvious cover-ups for injuries, like someone who's wearing long sleeves in the summer or
Mhm.
sunglasses indoors. But we do often see people experiencing psychosomatic symptoms as well. So they could be sick a lot, or
Mhm.
they could have headaches or stomach aches, things like that. So we do see it play out in a lot of different ways. Isolation is another,
Mhm.
and withdrawal. So somebody who doesn't want to go out with their coworkers after work because their
Mm.
partner says they have to be home by 5:30, or someone who can't go out to lunch with their team because their partner says they've already spent all the money they're allowed to spend that week.
Right. Okay. So, a lot of times I think in the past people thought, well, the sign of domestic violence is if someone comes to work with bruises. It's so far beyond that, as what you're saying, are those symptoms that appear. And again, I think it's the totality of the circumstances, right? Is taking in all that information that we're seeing and collecting about our colleagues or as managers or supervisors of our subordinates as well. Um, what are the most common misconceptions that organizations have about that intersection of domestic violence and workplace safety? What are those misconceptions out there?
I think the biggest one is that it's a personal issue, that it's not a workplace issue. So some employers believe that if it happens off the clock, it doesn't have anything to do with them. And that is not true. As we just said, it does spill over into the workplace and it does impact the workplace from a safety perspective, but also from a cost perspective, because all of that absenteeism, lost productivity, increased healthcare costs adds up. So employers
Yeah.
definitely are seeing this impact the workplace, even if it's not directly obvious. The other thing I think that is important to remember is that if you're a employer and you're not getting domestic violence disclosures, let's say you're a large company, a
Mhm.
thousand employees or more, and
Okay.
you're not getting that, then something is really wrong because we know statistically that domestic violence is present and you're not hearing about it, which means your employees don't trust you. And that's a big problem because that means that employers are flying blind. They don't know what's coming at them as far as risk, and they can't measure the cost either.
That's really interesting. I think that's a very, very important point. I think for all of our employers that are listening out there, I really take note of that. Exactly what Lynn said. And that is if you're not getting some sort of disclosures, and I assume you use the example of 1,000 employee business, it's still a small handful, but you should see some, right? Right, Lynn?
Oh, absolutely. You should be seeing something. We do know that in companies that are multinational with operations around the world, we do have some parts of the world where you're going to see less just because of cultural aspects.
Good
But
point.
in North America, you should be seeing some glimpse of that. And if you're not, then you really need to take a look at how you are talking to your employees about the issue, and how you are making them feel in terms of the level of trust that they have for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. That feeds perfectly into my next question. And that is what we've seen in a lot of workplace situations is that an individual does have an active restraining order. It depends on, their state and their state laws and whatnot. But let's just say in many cases, we do see some sort of a restraining order against their spouse, their partner, whoever this is. What kind of protocols should be in place in a business for handling that disclosure of, hey, I have an active restraining order against my spouse?
Mhm. So restraining orders are a little bit of, I find a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction.
Hmm.
When people hear about domestic violence, they automatically say, just get a restraining order.
Right.
And the problem with that is that a restraining order is really a double-edged sword. So you have pros and cons. The pros are that it's a great tool for law enforcement
Yeah.
and it creates a paper trail and it might work. The con is that in domestic violence, restraining orders are violated roughly 60% of the time,
Hmm.
and they often give people a sense of false security where
Right.
they believe that they're safe, but in reality, it's just a piece of paper. So we don't want employers or victims of abuse to feel like that means that they're going to be safe and there's not going to be any problems anymore. The other issue is that it can be what we call a heater. I talk about intervention steps in terms of either coolers or heaters. A cooler is what you want. It's going to make that situation calmer and reduce the likelihood of violence. But a heater is actually going to exacerbate it and make it worse. And in some situations, a restraining order can actually make that situation much worse and make violence much more likely. So we have to ask about the risk if we're going to talk about that. I never tell employers to recommend or, God forbid, mandate a restraining order. You don't want to do that at all because of liability issues. What you would want to do is ask that person, have they considered getting a restraining order? And if they say yes, then you can share with them how they might go about doing that. But if they do have a restraining order and they bring it to you, some companies mandate that their employees make them aware of that. But regardless, if they do bring it to you, then you have to look at the provisions and see how it may impact the workplace. So for example, if it's a situation of dual employee, which we see an awful lot, then you may have to make sure that those two employees are 350 feet apart during the day.
Right.
You may have to make some accommodations. If the situation involves a person of concern who is outside of the workplace externally, then you want to talk about how you're going to make sure that security knows that that restraining order is in place and how any violations of that are going to be documented and reported. So while they can be a good tool, they do also bring some concern, and it's important to ask the right questions to an employee if they're thinking about getting one.
Great stuff. Hey, for all of our employers out there, I hope you took note of what you just said, because I have heard it working with countless organizations over the years. I've heard these comments made that, well, we told our employee they need to go get a restraining order. And so, Lynn, thank you for really clarifying that they should be asking in a suggestive way of, have you considered obtaining a restraining order? And I think you really nailed it perfectly with it's a piece of paper. So where I see a lot of times organizations also rely on that, like, hey, they have a restraining order. What can go wrong? Well, just about everything. So I'm so happy you brought that up. So how has the increase in remote and hybrid work affected the dynamics of domestic violence spilling into the workplace?
It has created a lot of issues. First off, employers are not really sure where the line is. So we do
Mm,
know that if you have told your employee that they are supposed to be working from home, then you do bear some level of responsibility for the safety of their new workplace, which is their home. But obviously, an employer can't be in charge of everything. They're not there, so that they can't make sure that everything is going to be safe. So the liability is a little bit murky. We haven't really had a test case in the courts yet. The other aspect of
gotcha.
it, though, is that if people are going to be remote, then you have to have a communication plan set up if you know that that employee may be experiencing domestic violence. So you're going to look for certain signs that are a little different than what you'd see in person. Maybe somebody who doesn't want to have their camera on during a meeting, or they are unable to attend meetings that they say they're going to. In that case, you would want to inquire, but you have to ask in a safe way because you need to remember they are at home with their abuser who may be monitoring their communications. So if you do know that someone is having issues with domestic violence, then you can make a safety plan with them and you can make sure that you have their address, for example. I recently worked on a case where an employee was abused in front of their colleagues in a Zoom call. And while it was happening, everybody was freaking out, saying we have to get help to this person, but nobody knew that person's address. So they couldn't send the police. So we need to do a little bit of prep work if we know we have a lot of people who are working from home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume changes of some protocols to address that as well is appropriate. You said something that's very important. And like I said, I always like to kind of point out those very key things that we need to be sure we're listening to. And that is, I think that could be kind of a response from a supervisor or manager. Let's say, using that example of we're in a Zoom meeting, right? We're remote, the team's there, this individual doesn't have their camera off. There's other circumstances that are making us consider that they may be the victims of some sort of abuse at home. And we end the meeting with everyone else and go, hey, so and so, can you just stay online for a minute? Hey, is everything okay? What's going on at home? You are spot on. That's not the place to be talking about that. What would you kind of suggest someone do at that point to kind of ask those questions, knowing that on the other side of that camera, standing right behind that person, could be their
Mm,
abuser?
yeah. I would make up an excuse for them to have to come into the office. I would say,
Yeah.
hey, we have some paperwork that you need to sign. Can you come
Mm,
in on Monday at 2 o'clock and sign this paperwork? And then once they do come in, that's when you can start the conversation of, we have concerns, about your safety, and we want to talk to you about making a plan.
gotcha. Countless times we've heard these examples of employees who are concerned about their coworkers because they strongly believe they are victims of domestic violence or abuse, but they don't want to get involved. They don't know who to tell. They don't want to get it wrong because they're concerned they're going to get someone in trouble. What can employers do to support, when appropriate, those concerns of employees that exist out there about their colleagues?
Mhm. Well, it's actually the most common person that receives a disclosure in the workplace,
Mm,
is a coworker. So that happens a lot. And it's pretty important for businesses to lay the groundwork before that even happens. So it starts with creating this culture of trust and confidentiality where people understand that if they come forward about concerns regarding themselves or someone else, that that is going to be taken seriously and it's going to be handled. It should be reflected in policy that nobody is going to lose their job for coming forward. So you're not getting somebody in trouble. And anyone who is part of that workplace should have received at least some training on what we call the 3 R's. The 3 R's stands for recognize, respond, and refer.
mhm,
So on the base employee level, that means identifying who might be a victim of domestic violence. What kind of signs would you be looking for? How
mhm,
would you safely and sensitively communicate with them about that concern?
mhm,
And who would you refer them to? So in the workplace, it's going to be your HR, security, management, someone who's in a position to receive that disclosure and do something about it. So once everybody's been trained, we need to normalize reporting as an act of care, not an act of interference. We need to let people know that even if you're wrong about what your suspicions are, something is going on with that individual. And even if it's not domestic violence, it could be something else they need help with. So it's really a way of caring about your fellow employees by expressing those concerns so that regardless of what their issue is, they can get the help they need.
excellent. Hey, just kind of a gut question here for you. Is there value in organizations to putting any type of notice up? Like, we say a lot of times to put information up that deals with responding to emergencies in the workplace, how to evacuate, run, hide, fight, those sort of things. Is there any value to any type of notification that, hey, if you're a victim of domestic abuse, anything like that? Or is it more just kind of that subtle undertone of here's how to report, who to report it to, what you can do?
Well, the materials that you're mentioning could be part of an employee awareness campaign, which
Okay.
we really encourage employers to implement. And so that could include materials like posters or merchandise like pens with the national hotline on it, things like that. And they can put them in specific overt and covert places. So you
Gotcha.
can put a poster about domestic violence employment laws in your state in the break room. Everybody can read it. But you can also take a one of those tear off sheets or like a QR code on a piece of paper that mentions the issue of domestic violence, stick it on the inside of the bathroom stall doors. Because that way somebody can access that information without anyone else knowing they've accessed that information. Nobody wants to go up in front of their coworkers and snap the QR code on the "Do you need help with domestic
Right.
violence" poster. But if you put it in a more discreet place or make access available online in your internal facing web portal so that your employees can go and access that help privately, then that is the best way to go about it. And you want to give them options for resources. It can't be just tell your manager or tell HR. We have to think about employees that are afraid to do that and they want help, but they don't want to tell their employer. So we're going to provide some self-access resources like hotlines and community-based services for those people as well.
Great advice. Boy, I love the comment about the back of the stall door. You're absolutely right because, so much of this is kind of this issue of personal privacy. I don't want anyone to know about it. And so we got to give them those opportunities to get that information where they're not publicly being seen getting that information. So that great advice. What barriers typically prevent employees from self-reporting domestic violence situations? And how can organizations kind of help overcome those obstacles so they feel okay about reporting these concerns?
Research tells us that employees have three main concerns around reporting domestic violence in the workplace. The first is they're afraid they're going to lose their job. And in fact, one out of every three victims of domestic violence reports either being fired or quitting as a result of domestic
Wow.
abuse and its spillover. So that's a legitimate fear for them.
Yeah.
The second one is they are afraid that their employer is going to somehow lose respect for them, see them as someone who doesn't make good decisions, see them as somebody who is not intelligent or strong, and nobody wants their employer to see them that way. And the third thing is they are concerned about confidentiality. They don't want their life becoming water cooler gossip. So
Yeah.
what we have to do is get ahead of that proactively and let them know that there are workplace protections, so you're not going to lose your job. Let them know that the employer cares about this issue and wants to help and will do something about it, and that the employer will maintain confidentiality, at least on a need to know basis. So the way we convey this is through policy and through awareness campaigns, like we mentioned earlier, where people get information on a regular basis, or maybe at onboarding, or maybe during October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. They receive information about the company's position on DV and what the company can do for them. And that allows them to feel better about coming forward because it's not a taboo subject, and they know that they're going to be protected and helped.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of already answered, for the most part, my next question, but I'm going to morph it a little bit here. So, how can organizations create a culture where employees feel safe discussing domestic violence concerns without stigma or career repercussions? And that was kind of my canned question for you, but I'm morphing that into, is there a specific person in an organization that should be identified as that go-to individual, whether they're in HR, their supervisor? Kind of give us the lay of the land of one, who may be receiving these reports, and two, who's appropriate to have these conversations with potential victims of abuse.
Yeah, you definitely don't want untrained individuals having
Mhm.
these conversations. They're not comfortable conversations. They're difficult and complex. And we want to make sure that whoever is acting as a point person for victims of domestic violence knows what they're talking about and understands how to have these difficult conversations. So I would recommend there being more than one person. I would recommend a small team of HR individuals, for example, who have received specific training in engaging and working with victims of domestic violence. The reports are going to come in from all over. Maybe security witnesses an incident, or maybe somebody's manager is concerned because they haven't showed up several days in a row. So those are going to come from everywhere, but each organization has to have a very clear protocol and a flow chart of telling the managers and security and everybody else that when you receive information about a domestic violence concern, here is
Mhm.
who you send it to. And then from there, you can have a path for escalation. If it's a very serious safety concern and it needs to go to your threat assessment team or your security team. And you can also identify protocols for how people are going to be speaking to victims of domestic abuse and what kind of help they're going to be offering them.
Gotcha. So, what kind of language or communication strategies should leaders use to kind of normalize these conversations?
Mhm.
Obviously, we don't want to use language that's inappropriate. That in the goodness of their heart, they may think, "Hey, I'm just going to be very frank. I'm going to say, hey, are you the victim of violence? Whatever it might be." What kind of language or strategies should leaders be using?
We don't recommend using words like domestic violence, victim, or abuser because many people do not identify what's happening to them as abuse, and they don't identify as a victim and they don't want to see their partner as an abuser. So instead, we recommend that when you're beginning that conversation with somebody, you rely on statements of observation. So that could be something like, hey, we've noticed that you have a bruise on your face, and it's not the first time we've seen one. Then that leads into, did somebody do that to you? Or do you feel safe at home? Is somebody hurting you? These are questions that are not really identifying them or their partner as being under any label, but they're getting through using the behavior to ask about the issue. So another example would be you could say, we've noticed that you have been late to work several times this month. Is there a reason that you're being late that we might be able to help you with? Is somebody or something keeping you from coming to work on time? And then that way we can really drill down into what's going on and what we can do to help.
Gotcha. So now, from the perspective of kind of that safety planning, how do we kind of best support our teammate, someone who is going through this? Any specific safety planning tips that you have for protecting those employees who have divulged domestic violence situations at home?
Safety planning is never a one size fits all situation. So each one has to be customized to that specific individual and what their concerns are and what's happening with their situation. So when I work with employers and train them how to do this, we basically present them with a menu or a toolbox.
Okay.
And then they can present the employee with some of those options and say, here are the things we can do for you.
Okay.
And then we want to ask questions like, what can we do to make you feel safer at work? Or what
Right.
can we do to make it easier for you to do your job? So I can give you a few examples. It's certainly not an
Yeah.
exhaustive list, but I can give you a few examples of some of the remedies and accommodations that we recommend. Depending on the situation, you could change that employee's work schedule. You could change the location that they work in. You could offer them time off or flexible hours or remote work. You could offer them in parking lot escorts when they leave and come to work and leave the building so that they know they are safe in the parking lot, which is an incredibly vulnerable space. You can uh, make a plan with them for an exit path out of their area and designate a safe room on site so that they could go there if their abuser comes to the workplace and they're at risk. That's usually a locked bathroom or an office, someplace they can safely go. And we want to make sure they have communication plans set up so that if they don't show up one day, we have an absence protocol in place. So we know, do they want us to call for a police welfare check? Do they want us to call their emergency contact? Is their emergency contact their abuser? Maybe you have to go through their administrative paperwork and find out what kind of arrangements they would like you to make for that safe communication. So sometimes we have to be creative and think outside the box, but there are definitely a few standard tactics that we can use to decrease victim accessibility and vulnerability in the workplace.
Absolutely. I mean, that is so complex and there's so much planning. And I know your team with your consulting firm helps support organizations in planning for that, developing those policies. And I'm going to give a picture in just a minute at the end. But I have one more question for you. You know, looking forward, what emerging trends or concerns do you see at that intersection of domestic violence and workplace safety?
One of the things that I work with a lot is concerns around hybrid violence. That means that an employee who is going through a domestic violence situation, either as the victim or as the perpetrator, may also have other things happening. So, an example would be a dual employee scenario where a perpetrator is terminated from the job because they violated workplace violence policy by intimidating or assaulting their partner on site. When that happens, it opens up a area of great risk because then you have a perpetrator who now has a grievance with the workplace as well. And that can create a situation where we may unfortunately see acts of targeted violence like mass shootings. We do know that there are a number of mass shootings in the past that have been directly related to domestic violence, and that the primary victim was not the only person harmed, that also others in the workplace who are perceived to be interfering or supporting the victim or protecting the victim at the time of the attack are also harmed. So that hybrid violence where domestic violence combines with a pre-existing grievance in the workplace is something that we do see. The other trend that I have noticed a lot of lately, which I really like, is the fact that a lot more states are not only having employment laws that protect and support victims of DV, but they're also mandating that employers come up with plans to prevent and address workplace violence. About a third of workplace violence is domestic violence. So those plans come in really handy and can save lives if they are in place proactively. So you don't want to wait until there's a problem to do all this planning and put out all these initiatives. You want to get ahead of that and make sure that it's in place before the need arises.
Absolutely. Well, that is actually a great statement to kind of wrap this up and to guide you toward Lynn's consulting and training service at presagetraining.com. And that will be in our show notes as well. So you can check it out there. Lynn, I want to thank you for joining us today. This is, it's a difficult conversation, but you have really shown an important light on this for both employers and employees to better understand what is occurring out there. It's not, does it? It is. And so, Lynn, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. So don't forget to check out Lynn's website as well as the Belanti.net website for additional resources. And as always, don't forget to ask that important question before disaster strikes. Are we good?